Bibliophiles of the internet, my name's Adriana, and today I'm here to finish wrapping up the queer books I read in June. So in total, I read about 19 or 20 individual queer things for Pride, but I was pretty sneaky about spreading my reviews out in a few different videos. So if you want to hear about the Own Voices Arrow Ace poetry collection I read, as well as reviews for 4 other fantastic queer books, you can watch my Queer Lit Readathon wrap-up, which has reviews for Goddess of the Hunt, The Song of Achilles, The Mighty Heart of Sunny St. James, Caroline's Heart, and The Disasters. You can also find reviews for all the queer manga and comics I read this month in my last video where I recommend queer comics, and that has my thoughts on Bloom, The Avant-Gardes, Kaze-san and Morning Glories, On a Sunbeam, Heartstopper Volume 1, plus a few other amazing queer comics. So with all of that aside, I only have a handful of things left to review and discuss, so let's get into it. First up, I buddy read my arc of Cantatas by Carolina de Robertes with one of my lovely queer Latinx Bookstagram friends, Lupita from Lupita Reads. This book comes out on September 3rd. It's an Own Voices queer Latinx historical fiction set in Uruguay during the 1970s about a group of 6 queer women who call themselves cantoras. At this time in Uruguay, there was a military government in place, which made queerness a criminal act, and in the midst of that, these cantoras find an isolated cape, Cabo Polonio, which they claim as a sort of sanctuary where they can just be themselves. As you might imagine, this story comes with triggers for peripheral mentions of rape, the criminalization of queerness, systemic homophobia, brief descriptions of miscarriage, and brief graphic descriptions of the medical conversion therapy process. I think I want to make a 5 reasons to read video for this book because this is the second time in a row that Carolina de Robertes has just affirmed so much in my life. To understand this book, you have to understand that cantoras is a made-up slang term these characters create to telegraph queerness because cantoras are singers. And the story explores all the connotations of that word. Cantoras means women who sing, women who live, who are vibrant, who are joyful, who are keening out their existence, women whose songs are heard and who feel, and in return they are felt and understood. To literally sing is to lift your voice, and the voices of these cantoras are similarly lifted by their community and by acceptance. It is a story that realistically explores the political and social consequences of being queer in Uruguay during this time, but that just makes each moment of validation that much more poignant. There's a moment when a character says, "Safe is what you make with your own hands," and through all the turmoil and loss, that is the spirit of this book. It's about these incredible women carving out these safe spaces in so many ways. I have so much love for this book, and obviously I highly recommend putting it on your TBRs. I gave this one 5 stars. Next up, I listened to Xenovia July by Lisa Bunker, read by Taylor Meskimen. This is an Own Voices queer middle grade story about Xenovia July, a young trans girl who's just moved to Maine to live with her 2 aunts. Xenovia is very into computers, coding, and hacking, and when her middle school's website is defaced with offensive memes, she may just be able to help uncover who's behind it. This story contains triggers for bullying, cyberbullying, harassment, forced outing of a side character who's trans, peripheral transphobia and Islamophobia, religious fanaticism as it relates to homophobia, depictions of dysphoria, and brief allusions to domestic abuse. I want to preface this by saying that this story is less about computer sleuthing and hacking than you would expect, and it's more about Xenovia gaining a sense of self-confidence and allowing herself to be who she really is. Of course, Xenovia is very fearful and anxious. She is convinced that someone's going to see through her gender expression and basically ruin everything good she has in her life. So the story is very much focused on that experience, but it's also a celebration of the small ways we can validate young folks and make them realize that they are good enough. It's in the way her aunts take her shopping for a whole new wardrobe, or how a friend of the family lets her experiment with makeup, or just finding a group of friends who celebrate being different. Again, it is a book that's realistic in regards to what trans kids face, and it acknowledges the strength it takes to not only be yourself, but then to wake up again the next day and still decide to be yourself. My one issue with this story is that not every thread seems to connect by the end, especially in regards to how Xenovia tends to get angry and explode in unproductive, unhealthy ways, and I didn't really feel like that was fully addressed. And I felt like the culprit behind the school's website was kind of an easy scapegoat. But other than that, I'm really glad I read this story and I gave it 4 stars. After that, I listened to Kings, Queens, and Inbetweens by Tanya Boteju, read by Sonila Nankani. This is an Own Voices queer book about a biracial half-Sri Lankan lesbian Nima who's just been rejected by her totally straight friend while also dealing with insecurity stemming from her absentee mother and also stumbling upon the local drag community and trying to understand her place within it. This story contains triggers for homophobic slurs, peripheral homophobia, instances of misgendering, and brief allusions to alcoholism and domestic abuse. And I also think it's important to note that Nima has a tendency to assume people's gender on sight, even though she claims to know better, and she's also not always consistent with using pronouns that align with people's drag personas. Here's the thing, this is not a perfect book, but there are moments when it's vibrant and electric, and I just know I'm not going to forget it. I appreciate the emotional complexity of Nima's journey, the way her mother leaving the family reveals deep-seated insecurities about being worthy of someone's love and time and interest, and how performing in drag is the antithesis of those anxieties. Because to be a drag performer, you have to be confident, you have to be personable, you have to be larger than life. So as Nima is discovering the drag community, she wants to be accepted and she wants to be worthy of all those things. And she has all of that within herself, she just hasn't figured out how to show it to other folks, and she makes a lot of mistakes in the process. To me, the parts of this book that were most alive were when Nima was just starting to fall for this drag king named Winnow, when she was experiencing those performances and drag culture and obviously experimenting with drag herself. The flip side of that is that the story has a very slow start as we meander around this small town and live through Nima's uninteresting day-to-day life, get acquainted with these side characters who are not always relevant, and a lot of that just feels flat. And something else I had a problem with was that one of the characters started to question their assigned gender, which I'm definitely here for, but they were also like the town's most notorious bully, which kind of indirectly reinforces the trope that homophobes are just closeted queer folks. And even though this character did have a decent emotional arc, the implications of that are not great. That said, the ending of this book, which I think is just pitch perfect, really saved it for me because there was such great energy and Nima is finally embracing all these different parts of herself in a way that is celebratory and joyous. It honestly made me feel so much, and because of that final act alone, I ended up giving this one a tentative 4 stars. My nonfiction selection for June was I'm Afraid of Men by Vivek Sharaya. This is a collection of personal essays from Vivek Sharaya, who is a trans writer and musician and poet, and it's about challenging toxic masculinity, gender roles, cisnormativity, and the lasting collective damage they cause. It touches on her experiences of misogyny, homophobia, transphobia, and what it's like to occupy a body that refuses to assimilate. What's so powerful about this collection of essays is that Vivek Sharaya shares so many experiences that are central to her personhood, but these essays make their mark not by attempting to answer impossible questions, but by posing the exact right questions. For example, there's a section on body image and how as a trans woman, Vivek Sharaya spent so many years idolizing an ultra-masculine look, and how now she's expected to cater to the male gaze. And there's a line where she says, "What would my body look and feel like if I didn't have to mold it into both a shield and an ornament?" The revelations in this text do not come from Vivek Sharaya's lived experiences. Those moments when you realize masculinity's reach and impact often come when the writer is voicing those questions, because sometimes posing the right questions is enough. It's a collection that really tackles how we've internalized the superiority of masculinity and the way that inversely affects everything and everyone that is not inherently masculine, and questions how we can begin to change that. So I gave this one 5 stars. Next, I'm sure many of you will be happy to hear that I finally went to my library and checked out The 7 Husbands of Evelyn Hugo by Taylor Jenkins Reid. This is queer historical fiction about this larger-than-life Hollywood icon, Evelyn Hugo, who is much older now and finally wants to sell her exclusive life story to a completely unknown journalist named Monique Grant. Throughout her extensive career as a storied actress, Evelyn married 7 different times, and now the question becomes, who was the great love of her life, why is she telling her story now, and why Monique? First of all, I have to note that Evelyn Hugo is of course an amazing bisexual Cuban-American icon because we stan queer Latinx folks. And also this story comes with triggers for sexual harassment and assault, brief mentions of a fake miscarriage, alcoholism, and instances of domestic abuse. This is a deeply immersive story that presents an extensive, in-depth character study of this person who is so incredibly distinctive and vibrant. Evelyn is so outspoken and passionate. She's so vocal about Monique getting her story right and how she's tired of her experiences as a bisexual Cuban-American woman being erased or ignored for someone else's convenience. Because her career took place largely from the 50s to the 80s, her experience as a queer woman of color was considered taboo and posed a threat to her trajectory as an actress. By telling her story and sharing why she basically took on so many husbands to protect herself and the person she loved, she is reclaiming those years and not allowing anyone to shrink her down to fit in a box. I like that Evelyn really owns all her messiness, her complexity, her mistakes, and how for better or worse she continues to challenge expectations and surprise until the very last page. And And as she takes you through her life in these amazing first-person sections, you realize how people only see what they want to see until they're told otherwise. The only thing for me was that sometimes the writing was a little simplistic, which is not inherently a bad thing because that can also pull you into the story, but also that we didn't get as much depth and insight into Monique's story as we did with Evelyn's, and I really wanted to feel more for her and the part she played in all of this. But overall, I'm glad I finally read this and I gave it 4 stars. And the last book I finished in June was my arc of How to Be Remi Cameron by the one and only Julian Winters. This book is slated to come out on September 10th. It's an Own Voices queer YA contemporary story about Remi Cameron, who's known by everyone as the out and proud gay adopted black kid who is admired for his confidence. But when he's assigned an essay to describe the entirety of himself, he goes through somewhat of an identity crisis where he struggles to understand the person he is beneath the labels that everyone else sees. I also want to mention that the boy Remi is falling for, Ian Park, is Korean American, and again, we love queer POC folks. Julian's first book, Running with Lions, brought me so much joy and happiness. It had this infectious good energy that came from great group dynamics and amazing teenage characters who are fun and humorous, and we definitely get even more of that in this book. A lot of Remi's confusion stems from how he doesn't really know his birth parents, and part of him believes that if you want to know where you're going, you have to know where you come from. And this book is really about how he's realizing that maybe that's not always the case. I feel like the takeaway is about how it's not a bad thing to question your understanding of your life or your experiences, because questions lead to discovering new things about ourselves. And what Remi's really struggling with is that so many people will only ever see him as one thing when he actually exists at the intersection of all these unique experiences. It's not just the label of being gay and black and adopted. He's also known as a creative. He's an awkward guy. He's a fan of music. He's a friend, an ex, a brother, a son, a crush, class president, GSA president, a student. He's all of these things at once. I think it's also about how, yes, on one hand, labels can seem limiting because they basically say, I am this and I am not that. But on the other hand, labels are subjective. They're not always black and white, and we're allowed to take pride in all these things we get to define for ourselves. But also, I think Remi's anxiety over this essay really speaks to the struggle of how when queer POC folks especially are creating content that is inherently representative of ourselves, the expectation is that it has to be everything and it has to be perfect. That's the expectation and the standard set by everyone else, which is unfair when everyone is not held to that same standard, and there is this pressure to be remarkable and flawless when actually we should just be free to create something that's honest. I really enjoyed this. It made me think a lot about how we define our place in the world, and it brought me so much joy, and for that I gave it 4 stars. So including everything else, those are all the books I read in the month of June. If you've read any of these books yourself, or if you've discovered an amazing new to you queer book, feel free to share in the comments. But that's everything I had for this wrap up today. Thank you so much for watching this video. I really hope that you enjoyed it, and I'll catch you on the flip side of the page.